Good evening, friends. Tonight, we won't talk about the past tonight. We'll talk about the future. Imagine this. One day you wake up and discover that the world is no longer the same as it was yesterday. The traffic is gone, the network signal is gone, even the noise from your neighbors is gone. Only you remain. What would you do? Tonight, we're going to play the role of an utterly ordinary survivor, and from the most realistic and calm perspective possible, experience what you should do to stay alive when the end of the world truly arrives, relying on nothing but your own wits and your own hands. Now dim the lights, and with the sound of the bells, let us step together into tonight's story. The end of everything did not arrive with a single deafening blast, but with a monotonous crackling sound. You had already been alone in this apartment for 3 weeks. Looking out the window, the streets were completely empty. Only the wind blew scraps of paper and plastic bags in circles across the vacant road. At first, the television still showed intermittent footage of people in protective suits issuing emergency bulletins. Later, the image changed into a meaningless scenic documentary playing on a 24-hour loop. And now, even that final image had disappeared. On the television screen, there remained only the jumping black and white static and the eternal hissing sound, like waves washing ashore. That sound seemed to be singing the final requiem for the world you once knew. You tried pressing every button on the remote, but the screen did not change at all. You tried your phone again, still nothing. You turned on the radio and twisted the tuning dial, but all you heard on every frequency was static. At that moment, the tiny sliver of hope in your heart, the hope you had stubbornly refused to admit was false, finally went out for good. You understood at last that no rescue team was coming. No notice saying the situation would soon improve was coming either. The world you knew, full of information and voices, had officially gone offline. Like the television set playing static, you had become a forgotten island. You switched off the television, and the room instantly sank into a silence so deep it felt bottomless. You could even hear the pounding of your own heart and the faint sound of blood rushing near your ears. You stood up and walked to the window, looking out at that gray, silent city. The sun was slowly setting, staining the clouds on the horizon, a strange bruise-like purplish red. You knew very clearly that starting tonight, you could no longer go on as you had for the past 3 weeks, passively waiting and consuming what remained. You had to act, because when the anonymous lights go out, the only law of survival is to rely on yourself. And your first decision would determine whether you lived or died. This decision was mentioned by many authors of apocalypse survival guides. Within the first 72 hours of a disaster, should you leave or should you stay? You looked at this home you had lived in for years, which now felt utterly unfamiliar. Before night fell, you had to make your choice. You walked over to the emergency backpack by the door, the one you had impulsively prepared long ago after watching too many survival shows, and which was now covered in dust. It might finally be useful. You placed the long-sealed emergency backpack on the living room floor. When you opened the zipper, a mixed smell of camphor and nylon rushed out. You began checking the contents, as if grading an immature exam paper you yourself had written years ago. Inside the bag was a change of underwear, several pairs of thick socks, a multi-tool knife, a small roll of sturdy rope, a hand-crank radio that also functioned as a flashlight, a simple first aid kit, and several high-calorie energy bars. Their expiration dates, well, had not quite passed yet. Besides those, there was also a small waterproof metal tin containing a fire starter, a compass, and several wax-sealed matches. Looking at these things gave you a little reassurance. It proved that the version of you from the past had at least possessed a hint of crisis awareness. In the early stage of any disaster, having a ready emergency backpack is the key to survival. The things in that bag should allow you to survive independently for at least 72 hours after leaving a fixed residence. That is the foundation of all survivalist theory. Now you had to answer the most important question of all: go or stay. You began analyzing your situation. You lived on the 15th floor of a high-rise apartment building. The advantages were a wide field of view, a defensible position, and relative distance from whatever dangers might be on the street below. The disadvantages were obvious. Once the water and power failed, in fact, the elevator had already stopped long ago, and the tap water had been gone for 2 days. This place would become a vertical prison cut off from the world. Every day you would need to climb 15 flights of stairs to go outside and search for supplies, which would severely drain your physical strength. So if you left, where would you go? The suburbs? The countryside? You were not familiar with those places at all. And at the beginning of an apocalypse, everyone would want to flee the city. The roads were probably already paralyzed, full of unknown dangers. Sitting on the floor, you felt as if two little figures in your head were engaged in a furious argument. One said, "Run. The city is a death trap." The other said, "Don't be stupid. You know nothing about the outside. Staying somewhere familiar is the safest option." While you were trapped in indecision, a thought suddenly flashed through your mind. You remembered an article written by a veteran survivalist. He'd said that in most end-of-the-world scenarios, the best shelter is neither a remote forest nor a fortified basement, but functional, low-profile buildings that people normally overlook, places like a small library, a community center, or a moderately sized supermarket with its own warehouse. The idea struck you like lightning. About a 10-minute walk from your home, there was a mid-sized discount chain supermarket. It was a standalone 2-story building with few windows, set on relatively high ground. It also had a corrugated metal loading door that could be locked from the inside. Most importantly, it contained exactly what you needed most right now: food, water, medicine, and all kinds of daily necessities. You made your decision. You would not flee blindly, and you would not stubbornly hole up in this apartment that would soon become a castle in the air. Your destination was that supermarket. You would turn it into your first home in this new world. Among survivors, there have always been two main schools of thought about choosing a first shelter. One is known as the fortress school. They prefer places with extremely strong defenses, such as prisons or bank vaults, in pursuit of absolute safety. The other is known as the resource school. They believe being close to sustainable resources such as water, food storage, or farmland is more important than pure physical defense. Your choice was clearly closer to the latter. You stood up, took out the nearly expired energy bars from your backpack, and replaced them with the last few packs of compressed biscuits and a bottle of water from your apartment. You checked the sharpness of the knife and stuffed the detailed paper map of the city, something you had bought, but never once unfolded, into the side pocket of the bag. You put on your sturdiest, most wear-resistant hiking boots, locked the apartment door from the inside with a key, took a deep breath, and pulled open the heavy fire door leading to the stairwell. Your first expedition was about to begin. You stood in the stairwell, wrapped in darkness and silence like a thick quilt. Behind you, the fire door slammed shut with a bang, and the sound echoed for a long time through the empty stairwell. As if seeing you off, you turned on the hand crank flashlight. That weak, wavering beam was your only guide now. Step by step you descended. Your footsteps sounded unusually clear in the silence. You passed your neighbors' tightly shut doors with their festive decorations and lucky characters still pasted to them. In that moment, they looked like relics from a distant, civilized age. A strange feeling rose in your heart. You felt less like a resident going downstairs than like an explorer who had intruded into an ancient tomb. At last, you reached the lobby on the ground floor. The main door stood open. Several letters lay scattered across the dust-covered floor. You walked out carefully. The outside world was even quieter and cleaner than you had imagined. Without the roar of cars and the chatter of people, for the first time you could hear the wind blowing past the tall buildings with a low, mournful whoosh like the sound of crows' wings. On the street, apart from windblown trash, there were only abandoned vehicles carelessly left behind, crouched motionless on the road like silent steel beasts. On the way to the supermarket, you met no one. This city, which had once held millions of people, now felt like a giant empty stage. This absolute silence gave you a strange, unprecedented feeling, a mixture of freedom and fear. At last you arrived at the entrance of the supermarket you knew so well. The automatic glass doors had lost power and stood slightly ajar. You squeezed through the gap. A smell rushed toward you, a mixture of food, cleaning agents, and a faint but unmistakable hint of decay. Inside, the light was dim. Only a few high windows cast several gray-white beams into the gloom. The supermarket was in chaos. Most of the shelves had already been swept bare, packaging, shattered bottles, and trampled food were scattered across the floor. Clearly, during the early panic, this place had gone through a frenzy of looting. You were not disappointed. You had expected this. Your target was not the shelves out in the open, but the heart of the supermarket, the staff area, and the warehouse in the back. According to one of the most basic survivalist rules when searching for supplies, you should always go first to the places that attract the least attention but usually contain the most stock: offices, staff break rooms, and storage rooms. In a panic, most people only seize what is most visible on the shelves and overlook these behind-the-scenes treasure troves. You circled behind the checkout counters and found the door leading to the staff-only area. It was locked, but only with an ordinary knob lock. Using your multi-tool knife and a bit of force, you pried it open. The world behind the door was exactly what you had imagined: a treasure vault. First you entered a small office. In the desk drawers you found several sets of keys and a floor plan of the building. Then you entered the staff break room. Sure enough, the lockers still contained some snacks and unopened bottled water belonging to the employees. In one locker you even found a brand new first aid kit, still in its packaging, 10,000 times better than the simple one in your backpack. In the warehouses of many large supermarkets, besides food, you may also find unexpected but extremely useful survival tools. For example, the tough industrial-grade plastic wrap used for bundling goods. In an apocalypse, it can be used to seal windows, serve as a temporary raincoat, or even make a water collector. Then there are the small wheeled carts used for moving merchandise. They can become powerful allies for transporting heavy goods. With the heavy key ring and the floor plan in hand, you came to the giant corrugated metal rolling door of the warehouse. You unlocked the switch beside it and found the manual chain mechanism. Straining with all your strength, accompanied by the screeching metallic rasp of gears grinding together, you slowly pulled open the great door leading into your new world. The sight inside the warehouse made you suck in a breath. Just as you had expected, this was the real treasure. Canned goods, bagged rice, towering stacks of toilet paper, and cases of disinfectant were all neatly arranged on tall shelving units. You shut the warehouse door again and locked it from the inside. Leaning against the cold iron door, you listened to your own heartbeat racing with excitement. You had succeeded. You had found your promised land. Now what you needed to do was learn the terrain of your new domain. And the tool you needed most was not a gun, nor a knife, but the most primitive map of all, the kind that lets you tell direction from place. You spent the first night in your new fortress. You did not sleep in the warehouse, but in the small, relatively comfortable manager's office on the second floor. Using several old coats found in the staff lockers, you made yourself a simple bed. You barricaded the office door from the inside with a desk, and spent the long night in a state between sleep and wakefulness, gripping a heavy pipe wrench you had found in the supermarket tool room. The next morning, when the first rays of sunlight came through the office's high, wire mesh-covered window, you woke up. You did not immediately start counting your spoils. Instead, you took out the detailed paper map of the city from your emergency backpack, the one you had already crumpled a little from handling. You spread it fully across the manager's wide desk. The sunlight fell on the familiar street names and district lines, which now looked strangely unfamiliar. As you stared at the map, you felt something deeply peculiar. In the past, you had relied on GPS on your phone and could reach any corner of the city without effort. To you, a map had been nothing more than an unquestioned background that automatically zoomed and rotated on your phone screen. But now, this silent map printed on paper had become the most important tool, perhaps the only tool for getting to know and conquering this world again. In an apocalyptic environment, where electronic devices and network communications have all failed, returning to the most primitive and reliable forms of navigation and information, recording is an essential survival skill. You needed to learn how to read the contour lines, scale, and legends on a map. You needed to learn how to mark your own position, important resource points, danger zones, and safe routes. This map would become your second brain, recording every exploration and discovery you made in this new world. You found a red marker in a drawer. First, you located the supermarket on the map and drew a bold circle around it. That red circle was now the center of your world, the starting point of all your actions. Then, using that circle as your center, you began carefully studying the surrounding area. You discovered that about 2 kilometers away, there was a large hardware and building supplies market. At that location, you drew the symbol of a hammer. In another direction, you saw a community hospital marked on the map. There you drew a cross. Behind the supermarket, according to the map, a small river cut through the area. There you drew several wavy lines. These would all become your future objectives. But you also knew that straight line distances on a map could become winding and dangerous in reality because of obstacles such as abandoned vehicles and collapsed buildings. Besides paper maps and compasses, there is another, even older method of navigation that many people have forgotten: natural navigation. For example, in the northern hemisphere, you can judge direction by observing tree rings, usually wider and sparser on the south side, denser on the north, or by locating the North Star. Of course, these methods have limited precision and require considerable experience. But when you have no tools at all, such wisdom handed down from your ancestors may save your life. You carefully folded the map and put it back into your backpack. Now you had a preliminary macro-level understanding of your surrounding. You decided that before making your next journey outside, you first had to turn this new home of yours into a truly safe refuge. You stood up, picked up the heavy pipe wrench, and your renovation project officially began. Your fortress conversion plan had begun. You understood very clearly that what you possessed now was almost unlimited resources, but limited time and physical strength. So you needed a clear step-by-step plan. Your first step was cleaning and zoning. You spent an entire day doing a preliminary cleanup of the wrecked sales floor on the first floor of the supermarket, the area that had been looted into chaos. You put all the rotten, spoiled perishables, such as vegetables, fruit, and meat, into garbage bags and piled them in a far corner, as far as possible from the main building. This was not only for hygiene, but also to prevent the smell of decay from attracting unwanted visitors, rats, or something even more dangerous. Then you began dividing the building by function. The manager's office on the second floor, with its private restroom, became your bedroom and safe room. The warehouse naturally became your supply storage center. And the area that had originally been the bakery, because it had its own ventilation duct and a solid fire door, you decided to convert into your kitchen and workshop. Your second step, and the most important, was reinforcement and defense. The biggest weakness of your home was the huge, fragile glass doors and windows. You had to seal them up as quickly as possible. In an apocalyptic environment, establishing a safe, defensible residence is the foundation of long-term survival. You need to block off all unnecessary entrances, leaving only 1 at most 2 entry points fully under your control. At the same time, you need to create a buffer zone around your shelter to give warning of and obstruct potential threats. In the warehouse, you found what you needed most: rolls of heavy wire mesh used to secure pallets, and several large buckets of industrial-strength glue. You also found a toolbox containing hammers, nails, and a hacksaw. First, you used the hacksaw to cut down the extra heavy shelf boards from the warehouse racks. Then, from the inside, you nailed these wooden planks layer upon layer over the glass doors and windows with long nails. The light was instantly cut off, plunging the entire first floor of the supermarket into darkness. And yet that darkness gave you an unprecedented sense of security. Even after doing all this, you still did not feel it was enough. When reinforcing an entrance, besides physically blocking it, You can also set up simple noise alarms. For example, you can stack empty aluminum cans or glass bottles behind the doors you have sealed. That way, if anyone tries to force the door open from outside, the loud crash of falling containers will alert you immediately. This kind of low-tech but highly effective warning system is one of the signature tricks of many survivalists. You adopted the idea, you collected empty wine bottles from the beverage section and piled them into a mountain behind the reinforced entrance. Your final step was choosing and disguising your main entrance. You abandoned the conspicuous front door and chose the inconspicuous corrugated metal warehouse door, the one that could be locked from the inside, as your sole entrance and exit. Outside the rolling door, you used abandoned shelving and rubbish to create a clever disguise, making it look like nothing more than a heap of worthless debris carelessly dumped there. Among survivors, there has always been disagreement over the necessity of camouflage. One high-profile camp believes you should build obvious fortifications around your shelter, roadblocks, barbed wire, and the like to intimidate potential intruders and make them back off. Another low-profile camp believes the best defense is not being noticed at all. They disguise their shelters to look like abandoned ruins, hiding in plain sight. You chose the latter. You believed that in this new world, staying unnoticed was the key to living longer. It took you several days to complete this basic round of modifications. As you looked at the dark, sturdy fortress you had built with your own hands, your heart filled with both exhaustion and satisfaction. Now you had a secure shell, but no matter how sturdy a shell is, without a continuous supply of energy, it is only a splendid coffin. You had to solve the most fundamental problem of survival: water. After turning your new home into a relatively secure fortress, the next challenge you faced, and the most urgent one, was ensuring a stable source of clean drinking water. The tap water in your apartment had stopped long before you left. You knew very well that a person can survive several weeks without food, but only days without water. For that reason, finding, filtering, and storing water is the highest priority skill in all survival. Fortunately, your supermarket held a large stock of bottled water and beverages. You spent 2 days collecting every intact, sealed bottle of water, soda, juice, and even beer you could find from the warehouse and shelves, carrying them all to your safe room on the second floor. You made a rough estimate. If you were the only one drinking them and used them sparingly, the stock would last several months. That temporarily eased your anxiety about water, but you also knew that these were limited, non-renewable resources. Before they ran out, you had to find a sustainable long-term source. Once again, you took out the map. On it, you saw that behind your supermarket, about 500 meters away, there was a small river marked with a blue dashed line running through the city. That would become your lifeline. But you also knew that without modern water treatment systems, any open natural water source, whether river water, lake water, or rainwater, could contain deadly bacteria, viruses, and parasites. Drinking it directly would be tantamount to suicide. You had to learn how to purify it. On the supermarket shelves, you found several things that could be used to make a simple water filter. A few large plastic buckets, some clean cotton t-shirts, several bags of charcoal meant for grilling, and sand used for the bottoms of fish tanks. Following a method you had once seen in a wilderness survival manual, you began constructing a layered filter. First, you drilled several small holes in the bottom of a plastic bucket. Then, from the bottom upward, you laid several layers of clean cloth. A layer of crushed charcoal. Charcoal has excellent absorptive and filtering properties, a layer of fine sand, and a layer of small pebbles. This created a crude but very effective water filter. You slowly poured in some murky river water. The water that flowed out from the bottom had already become much clearer. Of course, filtering alone was not enough to kill microorganisms in the water. Here is a somewhat unpleasant fact about water purification. In the absence of any tools, one of the oldest purification methods is to use the sun's ultraviolet rays. You can fill a transparent plastic bottle with water, and place it in direct sunlight for at least 6 hours. Strong UV radiation can kill most pathogenic bacteria in the water. This method is still widely used today in many developing countries. But the safest and most reliable method is always to boil the water thoroughly. Using the filtered water, you boiled your first pot of post-apocalypse water in your kitchen on a small camping stove. As you watched the water bubbling in the pot, you felt an unprecedented sense of solidity and relief. You filled every bottle and container you could find in the supermarket with purified water, then stored them separately in the warehouse, the office, and the kitchen. Now you had a sturdy shelter and a clean water source. The two most fundamental elements of survival were in place. But the next enemy you would face was more terrifying than hunger or thirst, and far more invisible: loneliness and the boundless silence that could swallow everything. After solving the two most basic survival problems, shelter and water, you entered a relatively calm period. Your daily life began to take on a rhythm. During the day, you reinforced your fortress and sorted and inventoried supplies. At night, you returned to your safe office on the second floor, eating canned food and watching the moonlight through the window. At first, this absolute peace, with no one at all to disturb you, gave you an unprecedented sense of relaxation and freedom. No work pressure, no complicated human relationships, no endless bombardment of messages on your phone. You felt as if you were undergoing the ultimate social isolation. But as time passed, this peace slowly changed its flavor. Silence was no longer your friend. It became a huge invisible monster pressing down on your chest until you could barely breathe. You became extremely sensitive to sound. The faint creak of wind moving over the roof would make you break out in cold sweat. The sound of a mouse running inside the walls would make your heart pound. You began longing to hear a human voice, any human voice. Even the sound of an argument would have been better than this deathly stillness. You began talking to yourself. At first, it was just muttering your tasks aloud. All right, now it's time to go check the south window. Later, you started speaking to yourself in a loud voice, even giving yourself a nickname and arguing with an imaginary version of yourself. In prolonged, extreme loneliness, the human mind undergoes enormous strain and can even begin to experience hallucinations, delusions, and severe depression. This is the common enemy faced by astronauts, polar explorers, and apocalyptic survivors alike. How to maintain mental health is just as critical to survival as how to find food. You realized you could not continue like this. You had to find a way to fight the silence that threatened to devour everything. So you began creating a strict mental health maintenance plan for yourself. First, you established an unshakable daily routine. You required yourself to wake at sunrise and go to sleep shortly after sunset. You divided the day into different blocks. Morning was construction time, used to reinforce and remodel your shelter. Afternoon was study time. You brought back large quantities of books and magazines from the supermarket's reading section and read them. Evening was exercise time. You ran through the empty warehouse, did push-ups, and kept your body capable. Second, you began looking for something that could give you spiritual support. In a cabinet in the manager's office, you found an old wooden guitar. Although one string was broken, you treasured it. Every night, under the moonlight, you clumsily strummed the few chords you still remembered, and softly hummed old songs long out of date. Music became the gentlest weapon you had against silence. In fact, on some survivalists' emergency stock lists, besides food and tools, they also specifically prepare items for emotional comfort. A deck of cards, a portable chess set, or even small instruments like a harmonica. They believe that in the apocalypse, anything that helps you remain sane and optimistic is just as important as a knife or a box of matches. You also began keeping a diary. You found stacks of ledgers and ballpoint pens. Every night by the oil lamp, you recorded what you had done that day, what you had discovered, your fears and your hopes. That diary became the only friend to whom you could truly speak. Gradually, through your own efforts, your mental state stabilized. You began to get used to the loneliness, even to enjoy it a little. You and the silence reached a subtle peace built on mutual respect. Now you had more energy to plan your next challenge, and a far more delicious one. How to manage your food reserves scientifically. After solving shelter, water, and the first psychological crisis, you could finally focus your attention on the issue that made you both happiest and most anxious: food. Standing in your warehouse and looking at those treasure-like supplies piled high and neatly arranged on the shelves, you felt a landlord-like sense of abundance. You spent several days making an extremely detailed inventory and classification of all your food reserves, one that rivaled a library catalog. You divided all the food into several major areas by type and shelf life. Zone 1 was short-term consumables. This area held items with relatively short shelf lives: chips, biscuits, instant noodles, and vacuum-packed prepared foods. These would be your primary food source for the next few months, and you had to consume them first. Zone 2 was medium-term reserves. This was your true granary. Hundreds upon hundreds of cans of every kind: fruit, vegetables, and, above all, meat and fish lined up on the shelves like soldiers. Beside them were dozens of bags of rice sealed in thick plastic, along with flour, beans, and pasta. If stored properly, these things could last for years. Zone 3 was long-term strategic reserves. Here you placed the survival essentials that could practically be considered non-perishable. Poor honey that can traditionally last for decades, large quantities of salt stored in sealed containers, and various dehydrated vegetables and freeze-dried foods. These were the treasures you would touch only in the most desperate circumstances. In an apocalyptic setting, scientifically and systematically managing and rationing your food reserves is the decisive factor in whether you can survive for the long term. You had to strictly follow the first in, first out principle. Consume the foods closest to expiration first, and inspect your inventory regularly to prevent spoilage from moisture, insects, or rats. Using a large account book from the office, you created a record for every item of food you had. You wrote down the quantity, brand, production date, and shelf life of each one. Then you drafted for yourself a detailed post-apocalypse menu down to each day. This menu took nutritional balance into account, but more importantly, it gave your monotonous life a sense of ritual and anticipation. For example, you decreed that every Wednesday you could eat one precious can of luncheon meat, and every Friday night you could enjoy a small glass of red wine from the liquor section. You were immersed in the pleasure of planning when a chilling thought suddenly entered your mind. Although most commercially canned foods are still usually safe to eat after the expiration date, as long as the can shows no obvious swelling or foul smell, there is one deadly exception. If a can's seal was compromised during production or storage, it could allow the growth of a bacterium called Clostridium botulinum. This bacterium produces one of the deadliest toxins on Earth, botulinum toxin. Even an infinitesimal amount can kill within hours. And the most frightening thing is that food contaminated by botulism may show no abnormalities in appearance or smell. Therefore, before eating a canned food, especially cans that look even slightly suspicious, the safest practice is to heat the contents thoroughly and boil them for at least 10 minutes. That can destroy any toxin that might be present. You wrote this warning heavily into your diary in red ink. You also made a pleasant discovery. This supermarket actually had a small section devoted to seeds and gardening tools. You found all kinds of vegetable seeds, tomatoes, cucumbers, beans sealed in moisture-proof packets. This gave you the possibility of long-term sustainability. Looking at your food empire, you felt safe, but you also knew that merely possessing raw materials was not enough. You still needed to learn how to turn them, using the most limited tools and energy, into real food that could comfort your spirit. You had to learn how to rekindle the smoke and flame of civilization atop these ruins. Once you had a clear plan for your food reserves, you faced a new problem: how to create What you possessed was a mass of raw materials, along with a pile of tools that had been taken for granted in civilized society, but now seemed oddly useless. You needed to learn how to use the discarded or single-purpose objects around you to create new things you needed to survive. That is one of the core skills of post-apocalyptic survival: repurposing waste and improvising. You had to break free of fixed ideas about an object's original purpose and look at everything around you with a new, imaginative eye. A broken umbrella might become the frame of a fishing net. An empty soda can could be turned into an alcohol stove or a sharp blade. In this new world, imagination mattered just as much as physical strength. Your first creation came from an accidental discovery. In a corner of the warehouse, you found several large rolls of forgotten heavy craft paper once used for packaging goods. At first, you had no idea what use they might have until one evening, by candlelight, when you felt that the light was too dim and unstable for reading. A spark of inspiration struck you. You cut and folded a sheet of craft paper and used glue to turn it into a conical lampshade, placing it over the candle. Instantly, the formerly scattered, flickering candlelight was gathered and reflected, becoming brighter and steadier, illuminating your little office almost like daylight. You even lined the inside of the shade with a sheet of shiny aluminum foil peeled from a potato chip bag to further enhance the reflection. That small success greatly encouraged you. You began wandering through this enormous junkyard like an inventor obsessed with his hobby, searching everywhere for inspiration. You cut large plastic beverage bottles in half. The upper half, inverted, became a perfect funnel for filtering liquids. The lower half became a seedling pot. You also removed the rearview mirror from a broken-down car abandoned outside the supermarket. You brought it back to your shelter and, after careful polishing and cleaning, turned it into a mirror capable of focusing sunlight. At noon on a clear day, using it, you successfully ignited a handful of dry grass. That meant that even if all your matches and fire starters were used up, as long as there was sunlight, you would still possess fire. You began systematically collecting and sorting what others would call garbage. You divided it by category into different areas of the warehouse: metal, plastic, wood, cloth. Your supermarket was no longer merely a storehouse of finished goods. It was a giant raw materials base waiting to be developed. Every day you were busy and fulfilled. You no longer felt like a passive survivor waiting and consuming. You had become an active builder, creating with your own hands. Piece by piece, you were rebuilding a small civilization of your own. Until one day, an unexpected discovery broke the enclosed equilibrium of your one-person world. It was an ordinary afternoon. According to your plan, you left your safe zone for the first time on a short reconnaissance expedition. Your target was the small river marked on the map behind your supermarket. You needed to confirm its exact location, its current, and the surrounding terrain. You dressed in your toughest clothes and put on a light backpack containing only water, a little food, and a first aid kit. Then, through the disguised rolling door of the warehouse, you slipped out silently. This was your first true outdoor activity in many days. The world outside was as frighteningly quiet as it had looked through the windows. Your footsteps sounded especially abrupt on the empty streets. You remained on high alert, keeping close to the walls of buildings, using abandoned vehicles as cover, moving quickly. Every one of your senses was heightened to the limit. You scanned every corner. You listened to every suspicious sound. You reached the river without incident. The water was somewhat clearer than you had expected, and the current was gentle. You crouched in a concealed spot at the riverbank and carefully observed your surroundings. Across the river lay an abandoned park overgrown with sparse wild grass. Just as you were about to collect a water sample and head back the way you came, your eyes were caught by something in the muddy ground near the water's edge. It was a footprint. It was not yours. It was slightly larger than your foot. And the tread pattern was one you recognized well, the sole of an outdoor hiking boot. You touched the edge of the footprint lightly with your finger. The mud was still wet, still faintly elastic. That meant the print had been left very recently. Possibly only a few hours ago, possibly only tens of minutes ago, your heart instantly felt as though an invisible hand had clenched around it. A surge of emotions rose inside you: excitement, fear, curiosity, and extreme vigilance. You were not alone in this city you had assumed had been completely forgotten. There were still other people moving about. After the apocalypse, encountering other survivors is both intensely dangerous and intensely tempting. They may be your partners in rebuilding civilization. They may also be the greatest threat to your survival. How to judge a stranger's intentions and how to make first contact is the most complicated chapter in every survival guide, and the one with the fewest standard answers. You immediately lowered yourself and hid behind a dense thicket of bushes, then began carefully studying the traces around the footprint. You found only a single set of prints, leading downstream and away from your own position. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, that suggested the other person might also be a lone survivor like you. Someone who had simply come to the river for water. A fierce internal struggle began. Should you leave immediately and pretend you had seen nothing? Or should you follow the track and try to find this person? In the end you decided, no. You could not pursue. You knew nothing about the other person, and it was entirely possible that they had already noticed you, or the traces you had left behind. When neither strength nor intention is known, making contact rashly is the least wise choice. Among survivors, the strategy for first contact has always been the subject of an eternal debate between the active and the passive camps. Some in the active camp believe one should seek out other survivors proactively, because there is strength in numbers and cooperation is the only hope of surviving. Others in the passive camp believe one should avoid contact with strangers at all costs, because in a world without law or moral restraint, human nature is unreliable and every stranger is a potential enemy. Your choice now made you a firm member of the passive camp. You quietly took a different route back to your supermarket. Your back was already soaked through with cold sweat. Only after returning to your fortress and locking that heavy iron door from the inside did your heartbeat begin to slow again. This discovery completely changed your state of mind. You were no longer the only king of your little world. You realized that in the darkness beyond your sight, other eyes were watching this city. For the first time, your sense of security had truly been challenged. And a greater challenge was still ahead. The next morning, when you woke up, your throat felt as though it were on fire. You were sick. Your head felt stuffed with damp cotton, heavy and dull. Your throat was dry and painful, and every swallow was like swallowing a glowing coal. You struggled to sit up and felt that every bone in your body hurt. Chills rolled through you in waves. You understood at once that this was not ordinary fatigue. You had a fever in the old world. An ordinary fever or cold might have required only a few pills and a good night's sleep. But in this new world, with no doctors, no antibiotics, and not even a thermometer, an illness that seemed trivial could quickly become a fatal threat. This was the deepest fear of everyone who survives alone. You forced yourself out of bed and stumbled to your medicine supply area, the collection of whatever usable medicines you had gathered from the supermarket pharmacy counter. Looking at the colorful boxes, you felt a wave of coldness. Your understanding of these medicines extended only as far as the labels on the packages. And even those labels were often frustratingly vague. You found several different brands of cold medicine and fever reducers. You did not know which would be more effective, nor whether there might be dangerous interactions between them. All you could do was make a risky medical judgment based on names and vague memory. You chose a fever reducer containing ibuprofen. The one you were most familiar with, swallowed 2 tablets with your carefully stored clean water, and returned to bed, wrapping yourself tightly in every piece of clothing and blanket you could find. You hoped to sweat it out the oldest way possible, helping your body win this modest but serious war. Although you were grateful to have medicine, you also knew that without modern pharmaceuticals, some common plants might save your life. For example, willow bark has been used since ancient times as a natural painkiller and fever reducer because it contains salicin, the main precursor of aspirin. And dandelions, which can be found almost anywhere, are natural diuretics and mild antibiotics. Of course, using herbs requires highly specialized knowledge, because many useful plants can look very similar to poisonous ones. You lay in bed in a hazy state. One moment you felt cold. The next hot. You had many strange, grotesque dreams. You dreamed of the old world, of your family and friends. You even dreamed of the stranger's footprint you had seen by the river. You began to understand that one of the greatest risks of surviving alone is that when you become sick or injured and weak, there is no one you can rely on. You must do everything alone. Fetch water, prepare food, remain vigilant. Your body is your only tool and the most fragile one you possess. You lay in bed for 2 full days, surviving the worst of it on bottled water and a few compressed biscuits. On the morning of the 3rd day, when you woke up, that heavy pressure had finally lifted from your head. Your fever had broken. Weakly, you stood up and went to the window, looking out at the still silent world. You had survived. This illness had cost you dearly. Your physical strength had dropped to its lowest point, and your mind had been badly worn down. But it had also taught you the most profound lesson of all. In this new world, health was your most precious non-renewable wealth, and you had to protect it at all costs. You felt that you needed something to replenish the spiritual energy the illness had consumed. Suddenly, you remembered a place you had marked on your map, a place that seemed the most useless thing imaginable in the apocalypse, yet now held an almost fatal attraction for you. After slowly recovering from that bout of sickness and weakness, you decided to undertake your second expedition. This time, your target was neither food nor tools. Your target was the place marked on your map with the symbol of a book: the city library. You might think that in a world where survival itself is uncertain, going to a place full of useless books is foolish and a waste of energy. But after enduring loneliness and illness, you longed beyond words to find something that could feed your spirit. You chose a clear afternoon and set out more prepared than before. You arrived before the grand library, majestic yet now somehow desolate. The huge glass doors had been shattered. You stepped carefully over the broken glass and entered. Sunlight streamed through the high dome, casting several bright, sealant shafts through the dusty air. The library was exactly as you had imagined, so quiet that you could hear your own heartbeat. Most of the shelves were still orderly. Only a few books lay scattered across the floor, as if someone had leafed through them carelessly and thrown them aside. Walking among those towering shelves, you felt as though you were wandering through a silent forest made of knowledge. You ran your fingers lightly over the spines, reading names familiar and unfamiliar: Shakespeare, Tolstoy, Du Fu. In that moment, you felt as though you were holding a silent conversation across time and space with some of the greatest souls in history. After the apocalypse, knowledge, especially practical knowledge that can be applied to survival, may become more valuable than gold or food. An illustrated guide to identifying plants, a manual on basic mechanical repair, or a handbook on first aid could save your life at a critical moment. So your first priority was to search for exactly those kinds of books. You went to the Natural Sciences and Industrial Technology section, searching the shelves like a greedy treasure hunter. You found precisely what you needed: a local field guide with detailed illustrations of plants and fungi, a thick Boy Scout survival manual explaining a wide range of knots and field techniques, and several basic textbooks on household plumbing, electrical repair, and carpentry. You placed them carefully into your backpack, feeling as though you had just found a set of lost martial arts manuals. And besides providing knowledge, books themselves can have many unexpected physical uses in the apocalypse. A thick, sturdy hardcover can be placed under your knees as a temporary support. On cold nights, pages torn from a book can be stuffed into your clothes and shoes as very effective extra insulation. And in the most extreme situation, of course, dry pages make excellent fire tinder. After packing all the useful reference books, you did not leave immediately. You went to the literature section you loved most, and took down one of your favorite novels. Sitting on the floor with your back against a shelf, warmed by sunlight from the window, you quietly turned to the first page. It had been a long time since you had enjoyed such a pure, extravagant stretch of reading. You sank into the world created by words and temporarily forgot your loneliness, forgot the danger, forgot the shattered reality in which you lived. There has always been a debate over the importance of spiritual needs between the materialists and those who believe in the intangible. Some extreme pragmatists believe that anything not directly tied to survival art, music, literature is worthless, a luxury, and a waste of time. They think that in the apocalypse, the only book you need to read is one that teaches you how to repair a diesel generator. Others believe that these seemingly useless things are exactly what most fundamentally distinguish humans from animals. They are the last spiritual pillars that allow us to go on living as civilized beings. You remained in the library for an entire afternoon. When you returned to your supermarket fortress carrying your treasures and a heart that felt full. Again, you felt richer than if you had looted an entire pharmacy. And somewhere not far away, an even greater surprise, brimming with life, was waiting for you. One day after returning loaded down from the library, you decided to put the new knowledge you had learned from that plant identification manual into practice. You wanted to carve out a small vegetable garden of your own in the abandoned parking lot around your supermarket. You knew very well that one day the canned goods and dry rations in your warehouse would run out. Establishing a sustainable, renewable source of food would be crucial to whether you could settle here for the long term. From the supermarket's gardening section, you found all the tools you needed: a shovel, a hoe, and a large watering can. In a forgotten corner, you also discovered several large unopened bags of nutrient-rich potting soil. You chose the safest area, the one with the most sunlight, ringed by concrete, and began the hard work of breaking ground. First, you cleared away gravel and rubbish, then you mixed the potting soil you had found with ordinary earth dug from a nearby park, spreading it into a small but hopeful seedbed. One by one, you carefully sowed the vegetable seeds you had found earlier into the soft black soil. You watered them with the cleanest, purified water you had stored. When you finished, you stood before your little plot of farmland, your heart full of expectation. After the apocalypse, agriculture, humanity's oldest survival skill, would once again become supremely important. You would have to relearn how to judge the seasons, raise seedlings, fertilize, and fight plant disease and insect infestations. This ancient body of knowledge would determine whether a touch of green might one day appear on your table. The days passed one after another. Every day, you went to check on your little garden. But the seeds did not sprout as quickly as you had imagined. You began to grow anxious. Then one morning, as you came to the garden, carrying your watering can like always, you stopped in your tracks. In that black settled soil, you saw several tiny, tender green shoots, so small they were almost hard to notice. They were so delicate and fragile, and yet they had stubbornly broken through the bondage of the earth, stretching their tiny curled arms toward the sky. In that moment, you felt that all your labor and all your waiting had been rewarded. You crouched down and looked at those minute but vigorous specks of green, almost holding your breath. In this gray urban ruin, ruled by death and silence, that touch of green was like a miracle. It was a signal telling you that life had not disappeared completely, and that hope still existed. You knew of a very old and highly effective farming method: slash and burn cultivation. You can choose a patch of land overgrown with weeds and brush, set it alight in the dry season, and burn away all the surface vegetation. The ash produced by the burning is an excellent natural fertilizer rich in minerals and can directly nourish your crops. This method may seem destructive, but in the early stages of human agriculture, it was actually a very common and sustainable way of farming. Looking at those seedlings that had broken through the soil, you formed a new plan. You decided to expand your garden. You would need more fertilizer. You began collecting all the organic waste you produced each day: food scraps, vegetable leaves, and in a corner you built your own compost box. You carefully gave your seedlings a little more water. You felt that a completely new and deeper bond had formed between you and the land. You were no longer merely someone who took, you had become someone who cultivated, and to protect these fragile new lives, you needed a force more reliable and more warmly human. As autumn arrived, the weather began to grow colder day by day. At night the temperature dropped so low that even wrapped in all your blankets, you still shivered. The camping stoves and fuel in your warehouse were still usable, but you knew very well that their fuel was finite. You needed to find a more primitive, more sustainable way to heat and cook. You needed to learn how to build a real fire safely and efficiently. You might think that lighting a fire is simple, just use a lighter or matches. But what would you do when those modern tools failed or ran out? Mastering at least one truly primitive fire-making skill using a fire starter, or the even more difficult bow drill method, is a graduation requirement for every qualified survivor. Fortunately, your emergency backpack contained a high-quality ferro rod and striker. But tools alone were not enough. You still needed proper tinder. Tinder is the most critical and most easily overlooked part of fire making. It must be absolutely dry, highly flammable, and capable of catching from a tiny spark. Using what you had learned from the Boy Scout survival guide, you began searching the area around you for the perfect tinder. You discovered that dry, fluffy plant seeds such as dandelion fluff or the thin, papery inner bark of certain trees made excellent natural tinder. But in the end, the ideal material you found was a forgotten wad of dry cotton stuffing in an abandoned storage room. You gathered a large quantity of dry firewood and arranged it in your converted kitchen, the bakery room, stacking it from small to large to ensure proper airflow. Then you took a deep breath, knelt on the ground, and began your first attempt at truly primitive firemaking. You placed a small pinch of cotton tinder on a flat stone. With your left hand, you held the ferro rod. With your right, the striker. You scraped the edge of the rod hard and fast. A bright spray of golden sparks burst from the ferro rod and landed on the cotton. A few wisps of cotton blackened and curled, then went out. You were not discouraged. You adjusted the angle and pressure, then tried again. This time, a larger, hotter spark landed precisely in the center of the tinder. You watched as the cotton began to release a thin thread of white smoke from within. It did not burst into flame immediately. Instead, like a glowing coal, a tiny dark red point began slowly spreading outward. Treating it like a newborn infant, you blew on that little ember gently and steadily. Very soon, a small cluster of warm orange-red flame leapt out of the tinder with a soft whoosh. You had succeeded. Carefully, you transferred the precious flame to the finer kindling you had prepared. The fire began to dance greedily and joyfully, bathing your face and the cold stone room in red light. You placed a thick iron plate salvaged from a car over the fire, turning it into a makeshift griddle. You sliced your last potato and laid the pieces on it. Very soon, a plain but irresistible fragrancy mixture of char and sweet starch filled the whole room. The use of fire has always been the subject of a deeply contradictory debate. On the one hand, fire provides light, warmth, cooked food, and protection against wild beasts. It is a symbol of civilization, but on the other hand, at night, a burning fire or smoke rising from a chimney is also an extremely conspicuous signal, exposing your location to any malicious eyes watching from afar. How to enjoy the benefits of fire while hiding its traces as much as possible, for example, by choosing smokeless wood or making fires indoors, is a question every survivor must weigh carefully. You ate those slices of potato, crisp on the outside and soft within, and felt the warmth of the fire sink all the way into your bones. For the first time, you felt you had a little of what could be called home. You were no longer merely a lonely survivor hiding inside a cold shell. You were a real human being, capable of creating light and warmth for yourself. And when night finally fell, you would see that this world, now free of human light pollution, had prepared for you the most magnificent and primal gift of all. It was a moonless, clear night. After finishing your dinner and extinguishing the fire, you suddenly felt an impulse. You wanted to see what the world's night truly looked like after humankind was gone. You put on your outermost clothes, took a flashlight, and passed through the internal routes you had set up. For the first time at night, you climbed to the highest point of your fortress, the supermarket roof. You crawled out through a narrow maintenance hatch leading to the roof. Instantly, cold but astonishingly fresh air wrapped around you. You straightened up, lifted your head, and were utterly stunned by what you saw. You saw stars. You saw thousands upon thousands of stars. They were no longer the sparse, dim, blurry points you had seen in the past through a night sky badly polluted by the lights of the human world. They were so bright, so dense, so dazzling that they seemed almost to have weight, as if a great handful of diamonds had been scattered carelessly by God across black velvet.